Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Today, our webinar is Privacy and Security, Preparing for CCPA Compliance. My name is Michael Mays. I'm a writer and researcher here at Armor. A couple of webinar housekeeping tips as usual. Currently, everyone is on mute. We'll do that to ensure there are no sound issues. If you have any issues, please use the chat window to let us know of any audio or technical issues. If you're having some sound issues too, you might try dialing in with your phone as opposed to audio through your computer. Now, to ensure we're discussing topics that interest you, we'll conduct 2 live polls throughout the webinar, so please join us. At the end of the presentation, we will take some of your questions, but you can use the question feature at any time to ask about the topics that we're discussing. Today's webinar is recorded, and a link to an edited version will be sent to all attendees post-event. Joining me today is Armor's Director of Compliance and Data Privacy, Mike Anand, and joining us via satellite, as they say, is our special guest, Carlin Dornbush, President of American Cybersecurity Management. Will each of you tell us a little bit about your roles? Mike?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. As the slide says, I'm the Director of Customer Compliance. My role here really is to be the face of Armor when it comes to compliance efforts, and also to assist our customer base with their compliance efforts and anything that they may have that come up.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Carlin, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your company.
You bet. Thanks for having us today. My name is Carlin Dornbush. I run American Cybersecurity Management. We help our clients build both security and privacy programs. So we'll talk a little bit about some of our frameworks and so forth that we use. Most of our clients are based in the United States and have some sort of business in Europe or Asia Pac.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today. You know, the California Consumer Protection Act, or CCPA, is a watershed moment in privacy legislation for the state. And it's a preview really of what is to come in other states as legislators move to protect data privacy rights. On our agenda today, we're going to talk about some of the basics of CCPA. We'll talk about how companies should be building a foundation around privacy within their companies. We'll talk about a new privacy paradigm really that is being created and the impact on businesses. We'll discuss some of the challenges, provide some recommendations, and of course, we'll take some of your questions. Now, before we get started, please join me in the first of our live polls. For the first one, I'd like to ask, 1 full month into its enactment, how would you rate your company's level of preparedness for CCPA compliance? You know, Mike, a MediaPro survey recently of about 600 different companies said a majority of employees, about 60%, didn't know their organization needed to comply with CCPA.
So yeah, I mean, that's not surprising, because you know, I'm in the privacy industry, and you know, I'm not all that sure too, you know, who it's applicable to. So if I do business with a California company, does that apply to me? If I live in Texas, is it only for California residents? What sort of companies have to adhere to the legislation? All this is stuff we're going to cover today.
Right.
So.
Well, now we've got our results in, and you know, so not surprising, a majority have said that they've started, but they really feel they have some significant work ahead of them. And then there's also, you know, a large percentage that say they haven't started at all. So it's an interesting mix of responses.
Yep. Well, hopefully we can provide some good information and give them some starting or at least launching points to get started. And then, you know, before too long, they'll be right where they need to be.
You bet. Well, so let's begin. Tell us a little bit about some of the basics of CCPA, Mike. I mean, tell us, you know, what are some of the new privacy rights that are established for consumers, and when does the law go into effect?
So it actually went into effect on January 1st of this year, although the Attorney General for the state of California has pushed back any sort of judgments or determinations on penalties to, I think it's July 1st. So we've got a little bit of a reprieve where we can still get things implemented and up to speed. As far as, what are the basic principles? So the CCPA allows consumers to request or at least have a view into the information that's being collected on them. They're allowed to find out from companies what information about them is being sold to other entities. They have the option to opt out of any selling of their information. Obviously, they can get a personal copy of the information that's being collected. And then they can sue for damages, which is the big thing. They can sue for damages if there's a breach of their personal information.
So there's new accountability really for those people who are responsible for maintaining that data. And Carlin, tell me, does this affect everyone? Is this specifically any person that is doing business in California?
Well, almost. It is a little different than what folks may have heard about from, say, GDPR, where GDPR is very broad. In the case of CCPA, they have started to set a floor to this. So really, it's for businesses, most of them nonprofit, for-profit businesses. Some nonprofits can fall into that category depending on how they're benefiting from the revenues. But really think about it as $25 million in revenue and above is a good way to look at it. And then there's a couple of other conditions which could make you subject to this law. One is if you are managing more than 50,000 individuals of personal information in your system, or if you're generating half your revenues from the sale of personal data.
Over the last 20 years, the collection, use, and sale of consumer data has really created some of the most profitable companies in the world, right? When you think of Facebook, you think of Google, you think of Yahoo, but with really little oversight into how data is exploited and few mechanisms for recourse when they are. Right?
Absolutely.
So, Carlin, kind of continuing along that line, tell us a little bit about the types of personal data that this law covers.
You bet. You kind of have a list here in front of you, but there's really a lot of detail kind of behind a lot of these. Personal identifiers, are actually fairly broadly described as really your name, an alias that you might have, any other personal identifiers like your driver's license. So any business that has that type of information is going to have to deal with this type of compliance. Obviously, any prior defined, protected classification under California law, but really commercial information. So, that could be just knowing where your personal property is, or the types of products that you've procured or services that you've procured. So once again, it's fairly broad. Even broader yet is the internet activity. So your browser history, your search history, how you interact on the web. If a business is starting to gather that information on the individual, then they're going to be subject to this.
Right, so things like your browser history and your search history. And I think it's interesting too, the detail that it goes into in terms of biometric data, facial recognition, things like palm prints, even voice recordings.
That's right. And even if you're collecting data in your, it's for a broad use, and you're building a profile about that individual, either trends, their behaviors, their attitudes, maybe trends towards topics or services or opinions, that's going to be subject as well.
There's a kind of an interesting question that came through the chat. A couple of things. That $25 million that we talked about in terms of revenue, is that related just to revenue within the state, or is it an overall as a company?
That's total revenue.
Total revenue, right. So, Mike, of course, when it comes to issues of enforcement, in a law of this nature, there has to be incentives or penalties, right? So tell me a little bit about how that works with CCPA?
So unfortunately, we really have to wait until we see some of the outcomes. But they're on the record as saying that up to $7,500 per record if a breach occurs. And so, the thing that's interesting to me is I wonder, can this be, monetized for people in California? Can they start looking at the companies that were breached, find out if they have, data on the companies storing their data? And if it was part of that breach, can they go out and start making money by going to these different companies? I mean, because you're hearing about breaches every day. And so this is really going to put the onus on companies that are, buying and selling data. Do you have the necessary protections in place? So yeah, it's really, you can read that slide and see what is being said about CCPA, but really it comes down to what are the courts doing when these cases come through.
CCPA is emulating really GDPR in many ways, and
Truly.
the fines for GDPR really just began in July. And while most of those have been in the 5 figures, 2 really notable ones, both Marriott and British Airways. British Airways was fined 183 million pounds, about $230 million for a breach that exposed many customers. And then Marriott as well, about 300,000 customers were exposed, and they received a fine of 100 million pounds. And so, they can certainly be substantial. And when you begin to rack up both per record and then those that can come for actual damages.
And the good thing about that, the teeth that GDPR has really got people to step in line and do the things that they're supposed to be doing. Prior to GDPR, I think the max fine was $500,000. So yeah, 180 million versus 500,000. That's quite a bit of teeth there. So hopefully CCPA will show that they mean business as well, and the first couple of cases will really take those people to task.
Right. And on for CCPA, we have just recently on February 3rd the first use of enforcement, and there was a breach of data by Hannah Anderson and Salesforce. And the state AG has decided to also utilize CCPA in this as well. So it took them, I think 3 months to detect all this and get notifications out and so forth. And unfortunately, that was during a period where CCPA was in effect. So that's going to be a case that I think people are really going to pay attention to. You've got a big name brand here, and it's fairly significant.
And we really may see some of that ramp up in July, right after that enforcement begins. So Carlin, tell us a little bit, this is really about building a foundation around security and privacy. Tell us a little bit about how businesses can do that.
You bet. It's difficult for, a business to run in and just create a privacy program from scratch. And there's really some necessary building blocks that are required to get to that level of compliance. The first is really building out a data governance program. This is all around knowing, where your data is and how it needs to be accessed. And from there, we start to build that security program so that you're now putting, what we think of today as the traditional security controls in place, network security. You're performing pen testing on your applications. You've got some amount of third-party vendor management in place. And then we get to the privacy program level, and that's really about how we collect, use, and store the data. And so all that starts to combine together, which then can get you up to that level of CCPA compliance, or really any level of privacy compliance. So you start to leverage these programs along the way to obtain that goal.
So building that foundation, Mike, let's talk a little bit about some of those steps that companies,
Sure.
Can take to get there.
Absolutely. So I would say the first thing you need to do is establish whether or not you have any requirements under CCPA. And then once you do that, then you need to take an inventory of the data that you're collecting. And you have a choice to make if you are, required to adhere to CCPA. Do you separate the California citizens from everybody else that you're doing business? Are you going to have two different rules, or are you going to decide to treat everybody the same?
Some segmentation of the
Yeah.
data.
I'll leave that up to our listeners to decide whether, which one is best. Of course, it's always important to have, a baseline with compliance and what you're doing with the data. So knowing your data, let me just jump back real quick. You really need to know, what you're collecting on people. You need to know how you're collecting it. You need to know where and how you store it. You need to understand who you share it with. And is that data that you're sharing, is it part of a sale, or is it just something that it is part of your business? So each of these things are very important, because as you're going to see through the evolution of CCPA, there's going to be certain requirements that you have to do as a covered entity. And a lot of that is responding to the requests from consumers.
Right.
So number 3 is a big one. It's a large undertaking, and if you don't have some dedicated people to working on the implementation of CCPA, then you certainly should partner with some experts, and start with your legal team if you have one, and let them flesh out whether or not you have any requirements under the CCPA. And then, of course, you need to understand what the requirements are. There's plenty of information out there on the internet. I would use multiple sources so you make sure that you're getting a common message. And then once you do that, you'll understand what your requirements are, and then you can start mapping those controls to those regulations. And then I would always, just follow your best practice. If you're doing something that's working for your SOC 2 audits or your PCI audits, I would try to incorporate that within your privacy program.
Right. So Carlin, let's talk a little bit about some of those security controls and considerations when we're doing this.
That's right, and we know it's extremely difficult to have a privacy program without a security program. And looking at those security controls from a policy perspective and really a procedural perspective are extremely important. Knowing how you're handling data, and certainly if you are able to apply encryption to this data, certainly at rest and in motion, that's extremely beneficial. The other big bucket here or thing to think about is around data minimization, and that starts from the point where the business starts to collect the data. So think about only gathering the data that you need to move the business process forward all along the way. So from the time that you collect it from the consumer to the time that the data is accessed in your environment to, say, generate an invoice, generate reports, communicate with a third party, you really want to take a data minimization perspective and only utilize what you need. And then start to deal with really visibility, right, into the data that you have and how you've collected it. So there's several things here that I think tips that folks can use as they start to build out their privacy program.
And I might even add to that, looking at and evaluating those third-party vendors that you're working with, right? So that they have those controls because of, the potential that you have for exposure there.
So recently I was reading an article that was talking about the cost of a breach. And it was clear that a breach is much more expensive in the United States than it is in the EU. And they really didn't understand or didn't explain why that was the fact, but I took away from it just based on what was said in the article, that is because they have a much more comprehensive approach to what data is kept and stored and how it's stored. And when they no longer have a use for that data, it's wiped. They cannot repurpose data once they collect it. If it's collected for a certain purpose and they no longer have that purpose, they either have to go back to the data owner and get consent again. Right. Otherwise, they got to get rid of the data. So in the US, it's the wild, wild west. We're going to collect anything and everything we have. And I would ask everyone in the audience to think about this for a minute, right? Because storage is so cheap. For myself, I don't delete anything. I just go get more storage. And I think about all the music files or the videos I have or the pictures. just the worthless junk I have on those drives at home, I don't ever delete anything. And I think that's kind of the American mindset, right? We don't delete data.
Well, an important point to reemphasize is that the law went into effect on January 1st, and that's specifically because companies will need to retain 12 months of information on and to be able to provide that back to consumers who request it.
And they have been cautioning that it's got a 12-month look back. So really, you're going to have that data back to January 2019.
Right, important to get started.
Yep.
So I want everyone to please join us for the second of our poll questions here. So giving it some thought, what would you say are the biggest obstacles for meeting compliance standards? You know, there are other compliance frameworks that are well known within their industries, obviously, PCI, HIPAA, and those things. But, you know, this CCPA will expose people to some people who may not be familiar with having to deal with some of those, correct?
Truly. Yeah, you're gonna find that there's probably a lot of companies that, you know, are not required to meet any of the compliance requirements for PCI or HIPAA, or maybe they don't do a SOC 2, but all of a sudden they find themselves faced with, you know, the prospect of having to adhere to the CCPA regulations. And that's a daunting task. Someone that is not familiar with doing compliance or compliance efforts, it seems like a lot. So again, back to the slide that we talked about earlier, talk to some experts, you know, maybe hire somebody that has some, you know, specialty in privacy.
So our results, wow, an overwhelming number have said that competing for interdepartmental priorities, right? We're having to work with others who we all have different priorities, and the challenge of keeping that top of mind. You know, quite a few just keeping up with these regulatory changes,
yeah,
you know, as they occur. And then, you know, a lack of education and responsibility among team members. You know, we have to constantly train our folks about the challenges and about the importance of adhering to the compliance.
So I always like to compare compliance teams to internal affairs at a police department. Nobody likes to see internal affairs coming up, right? Or same thing, it can be said about compliance. So really, the most important thing to me is the very first one, executive leadership support. If it's not coming from the top down, then it makes your compliance efforts very difficult, because everybody has their own reality. Everybody has their own priorities. And just because compliance comes knocking doesn't mean people are going to drop what they're doing to fulfill a request, right? So.
And Carlin, you know, kind of on another point too, in terms of CCPA, there will be those who are now who are familiar with HIPAA and may need to adhere to that compliance standard, but they may also now be faced in addition with CCPA, correct?
That's right. So CCPA really knows no boundary from you know, additional compliance perspectives. And so, you know, for many businesses, this is the first time that they may be experiencing compliance. And I think that may be why we're seeing 52% of the respondents here talking about the lack of education, right? You know, for these mid-sized businesses, prior unregulated businesses, this is completely new waters, right? Maybe they're under PCI compliance because they process credit cards. Well, this is still something even newer that they have to look at. So it does remain a challenge for most businesses.
That's a good point. The people that are doing PCI compliance, the data that we're talking about here may be completely outside their scope. It may not, yes, they are probably protecting their cardholder data, but we're talking about all PII now. And it doesn't necessarily have to be related to cardholder data. It can be any sort of data that you're collecting on somebody.
And that speaks to really working with people who understand these, working with experts that understand.
Indeed.
So kind of getting back to you know, our discussion, you know, this is a privacy paradigm. Really, we're having to think differently about how we see privacy of data. You know, tell us a little bit, Carlin, about, you know, this environment and how we see privacy today and how we need to look differently.
Right. You know, I think it was interesting that I think it was last year or so that Ford Motor Company announced that they're a data company that builds automobiles, right? And businesses are now starting to really realize that every business or every aspect that they have in their business is very data focused, very data driven. their internal analytics, the way they make decisions, the type of information they gather from their partners, their distributors, their consumers. And so really we talk to folks about how really trust is the new currency, right? And so it's the notion of privacy. It knows no boundaries. It's in every part of your organization. It's in every industry, right? CCPA doesn't, separate out particular industries that it doesn't apply to. So your data could be in really a variety of different systems, and it's trying to give power back to those individuals.
Right. Right. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, the second thing is that we're in this global economy, and as we build our businesses, we want to deploy our goods and services into California. If we see opportunities in Europe, we want to go there as well. We want to expand and gain influence and gain revenues as fast as we can. So we're now having to start to consider, from a privacy perspective, these privacy laws as to where we're doing business, and we're going to see more and more of that kind of come this way.
Seeing big challenges for companies like we mentioned before, Facebook and Google and others who have long had free reign really to a lot of that data.
And the troubling thing too is that California is not the only state that's looking at this. There are at least 15 states that I know of that are currently reviewing privacy legislation. That creates a problem for businesses, right? Because now you're going to have to look at, okay, where is my business? Do we do business in Illinois? Are we doing business in Nevada? What are their requirements, and how do those map to what CCPA is requiring? So it's really going to be the wild, wild west for a little while until we get some comprehensive federal legislation around privacy.
As you said, a number of states are already looking at that, a number of both either proposed laws or where they're beginning to discuss it. Here's just the quick list of those.
It's almost like I knew what slide was coming next.
So let's talk a little bit then about the challenges and some of your recommendations on how folks can really begin to address the issues. We clearly have a cancel culture these days, one in which consumers are very quick to leave anyone who's providing them services or products. So that certainly is an issue. Some of the others,
Sure. Compliance and generating revenue. Are they opposing forces? I would say no, because if you are compliant, then you know that you're doing the right things, and that should bolster your business and give your consumers confidence.
Yep, and we can see that a lot of businesses, and especially if you look at that prior map that we have, people will become very fatigued, right? If you haven't been regulated before and you don't have those types of auditing and internal processes, then as you're being introduced to these new models, guess what? By the end of the year, you might have 3 to 12 more of these to deal with in your business. And so you don't want to pick them off in silos. You really want to create a holistic privacy program.
And of course, it's going to be cost, right? So how do you put that into the budget? Really not knowing what's ahead. For some of these companies, a breach that violates CCPA is going to be an entity-ending event for them. So it's going to, you're going to have to make sure you have your eggs in the right basket. And then, how are you managing that data?
And maintaining business continuity as you go along, right? Well, we'd like to move to the Q&A portion of the webinar today. If you have not already submitted some questions, please feel free to do that now. You also, if you think of some questions after the webinar, please feel free to send those to us. We'd be happy to answer them even as they come in. Just waiting for a second for a few to come up. So the first question, is there any structure of the law relating to technology suppliers and third-party service providers? For example, a personal profile on a car radio where several suppliers are involved in the storage and access to the user data, not to mention the car manufacturer. Right, so a number of people really in that data custody chain.
I imagine it's going to be similar to what they have with HIPAA, right, and the business associate agreement. You can't say, well, I wasn't the one that collected the information. You're still, at some point, you're a custodian of that data. And the collector is going to have their responsibility and the custodian is going to have their responsibilities. And I think it's that relationship between suppliers that is going to, take on some new requirements and some new processes to make sure, hey, yeah, I collected this data, but now I'm ensuring I'm relying on you to maintain the safety of this information. So if you're storing it on somebody's car radio and it's unencrypted and open and somebody can get in there and get it, then that's really on you. So keep those kind of things in mind, that just because you weren't the one that collected the data, if you are the custodian at that point, then you're still going to be held liable.
Yeah. While you're submitting your questions, I do want to ask all attendees to please participate in a quick survey that will be sent after the broadcast, where you can provide us with some feedback. I know we have a unique format here. Also, if you think about a question once the broadcast is closed, please submit those questions in the survey and rate the webinar. Now, another question here. So would de-identification be enough, or do you have to completely delete the information when requested?
You know what? I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. I would say you're probably going to have to delete that information. If the consumer sends you a request to remove their information, I don't think de-identification is enough.
So consumers have, the companies have 45 days from the time they have a verifiable request from a consumer to delete their information to respond.
That you glazed over something that bothers me a little bit: verifiable request. So that's going to be tricky, right? When you think about all the requests that are going to come in for, hey, what data do you store on me? Well, you have to verify the person requesting that data has the right to that data. That could be another method for breach, right? So, and I don't have the answer. I don't know how you validate somebody's identity when they're requesting their personal information. So again, a lot of this is going to come out in the wash as caseload comes through and the courts make their decisions. It's going to be an interesting time, but it's also going to be difficult.
I
think the challenging part on that question is the actual process of de-identification. There are resources available today that folks may have heard of, where all of your geolocation data on your cell phone has been publicly made available. And you're able to go into this database and actually find yourself just based on geolocation. No other data is in the data set. With just 3 points of data, I think it was your birth date and your zip code and a few other things, you can actually identify an individual. So to de-identify somebody in a database is extremely difficult, because you really should be scrubbing that information from your system to be thorough about it.
Right. Another question that we have, we talked about the 25 million revenue. So two questions really. One was, does the 25 million in revenue need to be for the main company or corporation, or include subsidiaries, or maybe for a business unit? Are there some stipulations?
I'll let Carlin address that one.
Yeah, that's for that corporate entity registered. And then I think a lot of people ask about nonprofit, and you may have a nonprofit subsidiary that rolls up for a for-profit business. In that case, that nonprofit is going to be regulated. So it does start to follow really up to that parental company and how the business is driven.
To answer that second question, it's any one of those criteria. So the three are 25 million in gross revenue, at least 500,000 consumer data, either on consumers, households, or devices. And then the last one is if you derive half of your revenue from the collection and sale of data.
Yeah, so the question was, does a business need to meet both, or
Just
one of those requirements?
Just
they
one.
really just need to meet one of those.
Yep.
Yeah, it's an or statement. Yep.
So there's a question that came in about the key similarities between CCPA and GDPR.
Yeah,
I would say
go
we're
ahead.
talking about new territory in the US and the protection of privacy. So the similarities are, we're talking about being able to be forgotten, which is one of the big things with GDPR. And I like that that's in there with CCPA. And of course, being able to take companies to task if they're not handling your privacy data in the right way. I'll let Carlin follow up.
Some similarities, are down to some of the principles, right? In that they're trying to put data rights back into the hands of the individuals. They're also trying to create transparency, right? The individuals need to know how their data is being used by this business that's collecting it. And so that's both true for CCPA and for GDPR. GDPR does afford more requests and controls by the individuals. And the big change, I think, is that, really GDPR has been around for quite a while. It just was called something different. It was a directive, and so the Americans thought that was a recommendation and not necessarily a regulation. And so when that was renamed and kind of hardened, if you will, and brought to the market in 2018, then it actually became a regulation. And that was really one of the first privacy laws that was very global in nature and was fairly lengthy in its description and detailed, and really got Americans, businesses, to think more about privacy, whereas in Europe, your data privacy is more of an inalienable right that you were born with, rather than our American kind of opt-out kind of mechanism. So CCPA is taking some of those things, but not quite as far as GDPR has gone.
Next question, really interesting. What does CCPA mean for K-12 school districts? How might it affect them?
That's going to be a little bit of a sticky wicket for folks, because they're going to have to get consent from the parents in order to do anything with that data. So the question is really, what are you doing with the data? Are you selling it? I think you would become, if you have over 50,000, students or records or households, then you would be under the requirements of CCPA. I think the cutoff age is 13. Under 13, you have to get parental consent. So you're going to have to get parental consent, but also you're going to have to validate that consent. And then I think 13 and older, I think the law is stating that they're able to give their own consent, which I find ridiculous. But Carlin, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it is, a challenge for the school districts. It'd be best that, the AG's office is providing guidance there for these, types of entities, right, to help them through the process. So I know that the AG's office has had kind of a traveling roadshow through California, and I think that attendance has been at almost near capacity of whatever venue that they're at. So those are things to kind of be looking for and attending, to really get into some of that specific detail, I think is helpful.
So this brings up a good point too about what sort of exceptions there are for CCPA. So anybody that's under GLBA, the data that they collect for financial purposes is not, or I should say, is excluded from CCPA. But there is certain data that they may collect that is not covered by GLBA, which they would be under requirements, and that would be like browser activity or internet activity. For schools, you're going to have to talk to your legal team, but I would think that data that's required to run the business, and in this case, a school required certain records to be held and retained, and I'm sure that they have requirements outside of what CCPA is about the retention of that data. But once those data retention periods expire, that data needs to be scrubbed.
They should have a process.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
You know, an audience member has also asked if an organization is fully compliant with GDPR, in terms of percentage, how might they also be compliant with CCPA? Are there some benefits there?
Well, it depends on how they're responding to those requests. I mean, there are what 5 or 6 different requests that they're going to have to be able to handle. And if they're already ready for GDPR or compliant with GDPR, then a majority of that should be handled, right? So when somebody asks for access to their data, when someone wants their data, when they want their data scrubbed, or they want to find out who you're selling it to, all this has to be readily available. And if you don't have a team that's managing that or able to respond to that, or the templates that are built to respond to that, and then the processes around that, that's going to be arduous. And in some cases, it means that you're going to have to do some code changes to your homepage.
Yeah. Carlin, your thoughts?
Yeah, right. So it wouldn't be the fact that you don't have to do anything. That's certainly not the case, because there are stipulations in CCPA for very specific language modification to your public privacy notice. And I would encourage any business that is GDPR compliant to do a quick CCPA assessment and determine where their gaps are. And if they have a mature program, then it should be fairly straightforward for them to then close those gaps.
Here's an interesting question from the audience. How is California boundary decided? What is it, the business office, data centers within there? How is that determined? Really talking about California consumers, those that are there in the state.
And that's really the first step, understanding what your requirements are under the CCPA. I believe that it's based upon the residents of California as your consumer. If you're doing business in California, then you are, and you meet one of those requirements. What was it, 25,000? Yep. What was it, 25?
Right, the location of the corporate headquarters does not matter.
Yeah.
Okay. So you could be in Asia and be doing business in California, and you will still be subject to CCPA. And
all it takes is one consumer. If you meet the criteria of 25 million and you have one consumer in California, you are required under CCPA to follow those guidelines. Now, you only have to do it for that one consumer.
It may make it easy.
It may make it easy to go 2 different directions. Say, if you're Texas and you're requesting information, you can tell them no. But if they're a California resident and you don't respond to that request within 45 days, they can sue you.
Interesting. It's an interesting comment from the audience. If the customer requests to have their information deleted, doesn't that effectively end their relationship with you?
Not necessarily, and the law stipulates that they cannot be discriminated against. They cannot change their price, they cannot change their service. If you have requested to be anonymous with them, they still have to do business with you.
Interesting. Yeah. Yep. So, and certainly no retaliation.
Yep.
Another question, if there is a breach, will both the business and any third parties involved be liable?
And so we just saw that with the new lawsuit that was just filed that included Salesforce. So you're starting to see the AG look very holistically at, where is that data resident, where is it stored, right? And really the parties that were involved with the breach.
Another question from the audience. So for marketers, will they have to offer opt-out or opt-in? Would it be true that CCPA applies to individuals who represent businesses when sharing data? In other words, how does this affect B2B marketers? You certainly saw with GDPR as it went into effect, more and more sites who had those pop-ups that were explaining their process and cookies. So will marketers have to offer those same kinds of things for CCPA?
I believe so, yes.
Yep.
And I don't think they have to offer an opt-in, but they do have to offer an opt-out.
Along with all those controls to make it easier. Yep. and those kinds of things.
Yep.
So, are there other, Carlin, you think other unique challenges for B2B marketers?
Yeah, I think in the detail of CCPA, if you have a if the model is opt out, I think then that business that is providing that opt out, I think only gets 10 days to remove that individual from the system rather than the 45, because they, the law is basically saying, look, it's so simple for you, just quickly remove them from that system. So there are some nuances there specifically for marketers, and that's where as that marketing business really needs to go through a detailed assessment that would then be kind of customized for them and their industry, because there are some nuances like that need to be addressed.
And so part of that other question, so if there is a breach, will both the businesses and any third parties be involved? I think the answer is really that continues to be the case, right?
Yeah.
We're seeing that.
If we use other compliance litigation as an example, I would say the answer to that is no. There won't be double dipping. Someone's going to be held responsible, and how you negotiate those relationships with vendors will really dictate who's going to own the responsibility. If you think about what happened with Quest Diagnostics, that vendor that they used is no longer in business. That was a entity, ending event for them. So,
right. Interesting. So here's another question. Do you see a privacy certification in the future, much like PCI or HIPAA has?
Well, there are certain certifications out there today, Privacy Shield being one of them. And I can imagine that it's only going to get, more involved. You're going to find different certifications popping up, and I don't think it's a bad thing, but it's going to be a little complicated while we're figuring out, what requirements are applicable, which ones aren't, which state do we have to, apply to. So just keep in mind that things are very fluid right now, and my dream is that, in the next year or so, the federal government will step to the plate and take care of this. But
here's a comment. So audience member says, I'm looking for a company who can help our institution to map our PI data and any tools that help us comply with the consumer requests. Those consumer requests will be interesting in how you actually create those processes.
yes.
So comments there, Carlin.
Yeah, the data mapping is important. And that can be done simply through a spreadsheet, and we have a process that we go through to help our clients with that.
Right. Question again from an audience member. Does a remote employee working in California count as a consumer?
That one's a little tricky.
Yeah.
I mean, they would be a consumer because they're a resident of California, but doesn't necessarily make them a consumer of their company's services.
Right. Interesting. And so
I do believe just last week, the state AG did clarify and did include employee data into CCPA.
Yes, you're right.
Oh,
yeah.
wow. Okay.
That's correct. Employee data does.
So it's in scope.
Is under the requirement of CCPA.
Yeah. And our final question, how do you prove the date of deletion? It's a real challenge.
And so
create process.
Right, and so that kind of goes back to the tooling for the supporting of these consumer requests. You want to have some sort of a trouble ticket system there. You're going to want to actually record in that trouble ticket system when the data was removed, and from what system, right? Time of day, so think about it like an auditing process were to occur. You want all your actions to be traceable so that they can be reported.
And I imagine if there is some sort of privacy certification, that will be part of the audit, that they will come in, they'll probably sample a number of deletions and validate whether or not that data has been deleted. So I think, again, I've said this multiple times, it's going to be very fluid. So,
one question I really wanted to get back to, what proactive steps can a business take to comply with CCPA?
If we jump back to the steps that we talked about earlier, you got to know what data you have, how you're collecting it, and what you're doing with it. And then, of course, you want to store it securely. And then you want to start building processes around the requests that are going to come in. Well, let me step back real quick. The first step is you have to come up with a privacy notice. And that's a requirement under CCPA, and that should be hard-coded or available on your front page of your homepage. And then the option to, opt out of any data collection, that should also be on your homepage. So proactive steps: learn the CCPA, take a class, or there might be a webinar somewhere that you could attend that covers CCPA, and you can learn some of the basic steps.
So,
wait.
So many great questions. I want to get to one more. For audit purposes, how do you keep records on requests without collecting more PI data? More personal data. What do you think about that, Carlin?
Yeah, and that's definitely a challenge, right? What you want to do is deal with, as few identifiers as possible, right? So you don't need to record the data that you destroyed, right? But you do need to record the requester. And that kind of comes down to the type of system that it is and the type of data that is actually handled by that business.
And Carlin, is there some data obviously that's more important than others in terms of
Well, CCPA defines all those categories at the same level, and something like GDPR does not. It actually has a couple of levels. They have Article 9 type data, where your biometric and forensic type data is of higher importance. So unfortunately, CCPA looks at it very flatly, if you will, that all that data needs to be kind of treated equal.
So going back to the one for audit purposes, how do you keep records on requests without collecting more PI data? So the exclusion would apply there if the data you are collecting and retaining has a definitive business purpose. You're allowed to retain that data, but for no longer than it's necessary. So I'd imagine collecting more PI data to fulfill those requests, you would need to keep that data through an audit. And once you validate that you resolve that request, you would have to scrub that data.
That's right.
For any additional questions, please send those in after the webinar. We will respond to those as well, to any that we didn't get to. And I want to let everyone know, of course, we have a number of resources for you. If you're looking for more information on CCPA, we have a CCPA cheat sheet that will help you, that really gives a rundown. And American Cybersecurity Management, of course, has a CCPA readiness assessment. And then we have a link also to an implementation guide for CCPA that you can find online.
There's another question that's come in around the deletion of backup data. And the answer to that is yes. Any data that you have on these subjects that have requested the deletion of data, you're going to have to delete. So I think our audience is really starting to understand the complications that are going to come along with this. And it's going to be an evolution. It's not something that you're going to be doing perfectly from day one. So just be open to the changes that are coming, because as this goes through case study after case study, there's going to be course corrections. And you're going to find, something that you didn't think of today, you may think of in 6 months that you're going to have to address.
Well, I'll ask our audience again to please visit ARMOR for case studies and white papers, details on our audit-ready compliance products and our continuous compliance monitoring offering. I want to thank Mike Annan for joining us today, and Carlin Dornbush for joining us from Colorado. And thank you, everyone, for participating here and for joining us in the webinar today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.